Bye. Have a nice walk, Jacob.
Have a nice walk, Jacob.
Sean says have a nice walk as well.
So do I.
I'll miss him the
Peter
whole time.
also says have a nice walk. Peter, I'm also walking. He says he's walking over to your house, Sean.
Okay, cool. Welcome to I'd Buy That for $1, a podcast about inexpensive, common, and underappreciated records that are waiting to be rediscovered. I'm your host, Sean Hartman, and I'm joined by my regular co-host, rewatcher of the 72 Dolphins, Jeremy Ruggles.
Yeah! Perfect season.
It was flawless, a season to be remembered.
Forever.
And immortalized in the Ace Ventura movie.
Oh, no.
Which has not aged well, I must say. It has not aged well.
Oh.
Anyway, we're also joined by diehard fan of Wes Borland's early work, Peter Cook.
Yes, I am a Fred Durst lyrical apologist and really devoted to Big Dumb Face.
That's what we appreciate about
which is
you.
Wes Borland's. that is a Wes Borland project, right?
Yeah.
How did I know
that?
Say
yes to Wes.
Yeah, say yes to Wes.
All right, Jeremy. You have got, from what I understand, the very first blues record featured on this podcast and one of the few that you can still find for cheap. Take it away.
Very true. I have brought Josh White live at Town Hall. Also, I think the first live album we've done, correct?
Yeah, I think so.
I think you're correct. I don't recall offhand any other live albums.
Yeah, we're going right down my alley today as the guy who likes folk a lot and also the guy who loves live records. A lot of people don't like live records. I love them.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes they're amazing.
And all those little like faults, that's what makes them beautiful, guys.
Yeah, that raw energy.
Yeah, as long as it's not one of those live albums where they edit out all of those mistakes and clams. I hate that.
Or a studio album where they add audience noise in between tracks.
Like Sergeant that's the Pepper. Worst. All right, let's, I'm going to just throw a track at you right out of the gate.
Mm-hmm. What you got?
It's called Hard Time Blues.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I went down home about a year ago. Things so bad, Lord, my heart was sore. And folk had nothing. It was a sin and a shame. Everybody said hard time was the blame. Great God Almighty, folks feeling bad, lost everything they ever had. Great God Almighty, folks feeling bad, lost everything they ever had. Now the sun was a shining 14 days and no rain. Hoeing and planting was all in vain. They had hard times, Lord, all around. Meal barreled and crops burned to the ground. Great God Almighty, folks feeling bad, lost everything they ever had. Great God Almighty, folks feeling bad, lost everything they ever had. They had skinny looking children, bellies poking out. That old pelegri without a doubt. And old folk hanging around the cabin door. Ain't seen time this hard before. Great God Almighty, folks feeling bad, lost everything they ever had. Great God Almighty, folks feeling bad, lost everything they ever had. Then I went to the boss at the commissary store. Folks all starving, please don't close your door. We want more food and a little more time to pay. Boss man laughed and walked away. Great God Almighty, folks feeling bad. Lost everything they ever had. Great God Almighty, folks feeling.
What year is this record?
This record was recorded at a concert in 1961 and came out in 62.
Man, that is amazing live recording technique, or what am I trying to say? That's amazing live recording production there. It sounds incredible. There's not a lot as far as the instrumentation goes, but it sounds impeccable.
Man, I wonder who could make such an impeccable sounding record.
Who could that be?
Do either of you know already?
No.
Quincy Jones.
Oh,
Nice.
shit. The GOAT, the man himself.
Yeah, actually, on the back of this record, there is like a section devoted to telling you every single microphone that was used on which instrument and like the settings for the Ampex tape recorders. And then it has Quincy Jones signed right
There you
underneath it.
Is there going to be, on other tracks, are there more instruments than just Josh White and guitar? Are there other players?
Yeah, there's sax on some, there's drums, piano. I think that's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait, Peter, are you saying that you haven't listened to this record yet?
Yes, I am admitting to that, Sean, but it's not my fault. This doesn't appear to be on any streaming platforms or on YouTube. I couldn't find any versions from this recording that way, so I had to listen to other versions of most of the songs.
So this is an internet exclusive for this album, thanks to the I'd Buy That for $1 podcast.
True.
Yeah.
This album is cheap, but I don't know if it's actually that. I have my copy, but I don't know how common they are. Can you speak to that, Sean?
Josh White records in general are pretty common. I've never really collected any Josh White records, so I couldn't tell you which ones I see more than others. He's just a guy that no one seems to listen to anymore.
Where did you find this, Jeremy? Was this your first experience with Josh White?
Yes, I actually got this at Sean's recommendation because Sean knows I'm a folky who's a sucker for lefty union songs and whatnot. And so he's like, here, you want this guy. And I got it. And my first time listening, I really didn't like it.
Really?
But I came around to it more and more. And I realized like the thing that kind of took me a little getting used to is some of his vocal affectation is kind of like that 50s, almost like Buddy Holly sound that he does with his voice.
Yeah.
That, like,
Sure.
really annoys me. I hate that sound.
That might be why I liked it immediately, because I love that about Buddy Holly's music.
Yeah, once I got used to it and like could just kind of tone it out, I was like, oh my God, these are really great songs performed extremely well.
Are you talking about that kind of ho, 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 that type of stuff?
Yeah.
It didn't occur to me, but that he totally does have some of that going on now that you say that.
I've heard that referred to as a hiccuping style of singing, because it almost sounds like they have a speech impediment or can't stop hiccuping while they're trying to sing. I don't know if that's any kind of an official term or not.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah, I've known about Josh White for a long time. I started collecting blues records at an early age, but the first couple of times I'd see his records around and listen to him, it just didn't seem like my thing. It was a little more on the folk side, which is a style of music I've always appreciated or respected, but not actually wanted to collect that much. So I kind of never really bought any Josh White records, while still respecting him and recommending his stuff to people I know that are more into the traditional folk sound, like my good buddy Jeremy Ruggles.
That's me.
Yeah, I guess I tend to lean in the more weirdo folk direction, I'm sure. But I can appreciate this stuff too.
Yeah. Josh White, I think, was the reason you find him in blues sections, but then also not marked up like almost all blues like you're not gonna find hardly any blues records in dollar bins. That's the price of those have been driven up, but I think because of how much folk influence there is in his sound, it makes he's like not, I don't know. I feel like he's not celebrated in the blues community, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Right, I would agree.
Yeah, he was part of the Piedmont blues tradition, which, as I'll admit, I wasn't familiar with that going into this, but in doing some research, the Piedmont blues tradition, it's also known as East Coast blues or Southeastern blues, and it refers to a fingerpicking guitar style that the melody and rhythm of that is comparable to the ragtime piano style.
Far out. I didn't even know that. I just noticed like, oh, he plays like a bluesy, folky guitar style, but I didn't know. Previous to researching this, I had never even heard of Piedmont blues, honestly.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
new to me. You know, I always hear of like Delta blues, obviously. That's more
Right.
like Mississippi, deep south. This is more kind of along the East Coast, and he's from the Carolinas originally, right?
Yep, Greenville, South Carolina.
And later on, he was more part of the folk revival movement, and I think that's what he's more associated with.
Right, because he was a member of the Almanac Singers with some other notable musicians.
Like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
I don't know if anybody's heard of those boys.
Well, I guess we could get into some of his story, eh? Josh White's story.
Yeah, you guys keep hinting at it, so we'll just dive in. I'm going to preface this similar to how I did in the Sammy Davis episode and say this dude had so many things happen in his life and his career. I'm not going to hit everything here. I'm not going to like make you guys sit through a 3-hour podcast. So I'm going to brush most of the main stuff. And, you know, if you really like Josh White and want to know more, there's a lot more to know.
Do you happen to know if there are any good books or anything about him that people could maybe check out? Because I definitely got the impression, just skimming over his history, that there's a rich history to be explored here, and I wondered if anybody's done an extra good job of covering that.
I read parts of one that was called like Society Blues. Let me make sure that title's right. Yeah, Society Blues seemed to be a pretty good book on it. I didn't read the whole thing, so I won't vouch for it entirely. I just read little excerpts here and there, and it seemed very thorough and to get into the nitty gritty of it. So check
Okay,
out
cool.
Society Blues. And whoever wrote
Noted.
that book, send me a check. Send a check to our P.O. box.
That's how we do things around here.
Anyways, Josh White, born in 1914, Greenville, South Carolina. When he was 7 years old, his father threw out a white bill collector who showed up in their house, and the bill collector just like spat on their floor. And his dad grabbed him by the collar and like threw him out of the house. And then 4 cops came back and beat his father brutally and tied him to a horse and dragged him through the city before locking him up, nearly killing him. And then they threw him in a mental institution until he died 9 years later.
Damn, that's
And that's where our story begins.
Jesus. Yeah, that's more detail than I read in the Wikipedia article. That is brutal.
Yeah, once again, the Wikipedia seems to gloss over the more brutal details. Starting to see a trend in that.
Yeah.
But after his father was thrown in the mental institution, Josh White left town with a black street singer by the name of Blind Man Arnold. And he agreed to send his mother, Josh White's mother, back $2 every week. And he would follow this guy around, Blind Man Arnold, and dance and sing and play tambourine with him. And he was so good at it that Blind Man Arnold started renting Josh White out to other blind traveling singers. And they would keep Josh White shoeless and in like ragged clothes because they would get more tips and get like sympathy for this young kid in
Yeah, and he's
tattered
how
clothes and shoeless.
He's really young at this point, right?
Yeah, he left at age 8 and continued doing this until age 16. They would make him sleep in horse stables and cotton fields and would feed him like just enough to survive, essentially. And he started playing in recordings with Blind Joe Taggart in Chicago, who was treating him pretty much the same way. And the producer of the albums finally threatened Blind Joe Taggart that he was going to report him for indentured servitude unless he started paying Josh White.
Yeah, saw that. I guess Blind Joe Taggart, most of the information available on him, or at least what he was like, is through Josh White, and he was supposed to be a real mean son of a bitch.
Yeah, this whole world of traveling singers seemed very exploitive and pretty brutal.
And I guess Josh White also called him out, saying that he did have partial sight, so he wasn't actually blind. He was just jumping on the blind blues singer bandwagon.
Yeah, that was confusing to me reading through because there were so many blind, whatever their names were, traveling musicians that it seemed like that can't be possible. Like it must be, yeah, like you said, kind of a lot of fraud going on in that realm, which makes sense.
But at the same time, if you were a blind person that was, in the extreme poverty working class, like if you couldn't do manual labor to survive, you had to figure out something else quick. Otherwise, you were just going to die.
That also makes sense.
Yep. And side note, that producer that you mentioned that was able to get Josh a little bit more fair pay, that was John Hammond, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Is
who
he
we
famous for
mentioned.
something?
Well, we just mentioned him in the Chambers Brothers episode.
Yeah.
Oh, far out.
Yeah, he's the guy that got them their Columbia deal, and we talked about how he had been an influential record producer for a lot of slightly more non-traditional acts at the time. Not to try and paint him as some kind of a white savior or anything, but he's an important figure in music history that has been mentioned a couple times on the show.
Yeah, they make a lot of movies about him, like Dances with Wolves and The Last Samurai, the white intervening figure.
Oh, those are all about John Hammond? Cool.
Yeah. So anyway, Jeremy.
So, yeah, Josh White starts getting money, and once he has enough money to go back home, he heads back home to South Carolina to help take care of his mom and help take care of his siblings. Shortly after coming back home, they send A&R reps to his house there to sign him to a recording contract. 'Cause they were like, whoa, this dude's too good. Like, you can't just go home and stop doing music. They signed him. Well, they got his mom to sign a contract billing him as Joshua White, the singing Christian. And then they got him to come to New York and get him to start recording secular blues songs under the alter ego Pinewood Tom.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of these singers would, depending on how they were being marketed, use different pseudonyms. A lot of these early blues and folk singers.
Yeah, and it was also, this was at the time of the race records. Sean, do you know about that as a record dude?
I mean, I've just seen the term referenced. It's definitely not a term that people have used in the last, 70, 80 years, but you see that as a critical term in, the early days of popular music.
The term was coined in 1922 by Oka Records. I think that's how you say it. Okay.
I've always heard it pronounced okay. Yeah.
Was it okay? Okay, so OK Records. And so they were records that were marketed towards black audiences initially. Gradually, white audiences began to purchase such records as well. And the term race record, it seems like in hindsight, it seems derogatory. But in the early 20th century, that was actually, race was what the African American community largely used to denote pride or support for black people and culture.
Yeah, see, I've only seen it referenced in a very negative sense. Like we had a, overtly racist term for just all black music, especially any kind of traditional black music. And then, when racism ended with the civil rights movement, according to Wikipedia and other whitewashed news sources, then, we got new terms like rock and roll and soul and everything, which in a lot of ways was just a furthering of the segregated music stylings. Like, if you were white and you played rock music, you were called a rock and roll band, but if you were black doing it, you were a rhythm and blues band.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. So I think the discerning factor would be that they were very open about the segregation between the musics in that era from my understanding from the 1920s through the 1940s. I mean, they basically would have a separate record label name for the black artists and the white artists, and separate marketing mechanisms, and even separate factories where the records were made.
And they were sold in different spaces too.
Yeah, which from what I read also gave rise to like some of the early black business owners and some of the early black label managers came out of that era as well.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And they would also take music like that had become popular on either side of the racial wall they had made and re-record it with the corresponding artists. So like if there was a song that was doing well with the black community, they would re-record it with white artists and release it under whatever their white band was. That's how I guess they would keep it separate.
Yep. Yeah, there's tons of examples of that. I mean, even with doing a cursory research on Josh White, it said that a lot of his songs have been covered and popularized by people like the Andrews Sisters and Frank Sinatra and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, like One Meatball.
Yep.
That's the song when I heard that one, I realized that I did know a song by Josh White. I knew his version definitely at some point. I had heard that one. I love that song.
I want to play another song before we keep digging in too much here. I'm going to do classic blues traditional. I'm sure a lot of our listeners know it, House of the Rising Sun.
Yes.
But it's actually sung by his daughter, Beverly White. And her version of this really floored me when I heard it on this record. So I'm going to play it for you.
There is a house in New Orleans they call the Rising Sun, and it's been the ruin of a many poor girl and me, oh Lord, for one. Now if I had listened to what my mother said, I'd have been at home today. But being so young and foolish, oh Lord, I let a rambler lead me astray. Go tell my baby sister, don't do what I have done. Please shut that house in New Orleans they call the Rising Sun.
You guys probably know this already, but the story with that song is it was a track that some blues and folk pioneers such as Josh White and Leadbelly had in their repertoire. And then a guy by the name of Dave Van Ronk decided that he wanted to record a version of that because he had been playing it regularly and was a standout of his live sets. And a very young Bob Dylan approached Dave Van Ronk and said, "Hey, do you mind if I record a version of that song that you're always using?" And Dave was like, "Well, I wish you wouldn't because I'm putting it on my next record."
Oops.
To which Dave said, "I kind of already did, and the record's already coming out. Sorry."
Yeah, Dylan
And then-
asked after he had already recorded it for Columbia Records, a major label.
Classic Dylan move. So Dave Van Ronk couldn't play the song anymore because every time he would play it after the record came out, people would be like, "Oh, it's cool you're doing a Bob Dylan cover." He's like,
Yeah.
"God damn it, he's covering me." And then when a little group called the Animals covered it, Bob Dylan couldn't play anymore because he started getting the same thing at all of his shows. People were like, "Oh, you're covering the Animals. That's cool, Bob."
Yeah. I love hearing Dave Van Ronk tell that story because he feels so justified when Dylan has it stripped away from him as well.
Yeah, exactly. Which is funny because Dave just stole it from black people. I mean, it's one angle that you could look at that. Also, I got to say that song is just so immensely overplayed that I don't really like it anymore. But that might be the best version I've ever heard of that song. That was amazing.
That was out of this world. That was the best Josh White version I've heard of it because he's recorded it with him singing it himself, as well as with Libby Holman singing it and him playing guitar. And I liked those versions, but that one just knocked it out of the park.
Yeah, that one caught me totally off guard. Similar reasons to Sean, like I've heard that song 1,000 times. I don't need to hear another version of it. But I was actually like, wow, this is great. I need to learn more about Beverly White. Look it up, and there's like nothing about her. She's done almost no musical things outside of she was on this album. She did an album with Josh White's son, her brother, Josh White Jr., and that's it. And there's little to no information on her out there.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that was just really something special. I'm really glad you chose to play that one. Yeah, you'd think like who needs to hear another version of House of the Rising Sun, but that one is something really unique and moving. It's nice to be moved by a song that you don't think you can be moved by anymore.
Yeah, definitely.
I think this episode is a good opportunity to clarify or elaborate on something we discussed in the Joan Armatrading episode a few episodes back. We talked about how record companies in the 1970s didn't know how to market a black British woman doing folk music to American audiences. And I feel that there is a real tragic irony in that because obviously the American folk tradition is largely informed by African American spirituals and work songs, and black folk artists like Leadbelly and Elizabeth Cotten. Artists like that, black artists made significant strides in developing folk music as listeners and performers now understand folk music. And by the time the 1970s rolled around and Joan Armatrading was recording, folk music stylistically and commercially had been co-opted, consciously or not, by white artists and producers, while other musical styles loosely rooted in similar traditions like soul and funk had commercially become the new musical black identity, largely because there were more black owned and run labels by that point. So there was a lot more agency in the black community, or at least a little bit more agency in the black community of maintaining some level of control over their music. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's no accident that a lot of the prominent white early folk musicians, we talked about Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, they were collaborating with black artists on a very regular basis because they understood that it was a style of music rooted in black tradition.
Yeah, and Josh White was one of those artists, those black artists
Exactly.
that they were working with.
Yeah, and Josh White, I think part of the reason he's not in like blues, what's the word for it? Like history is I feel like he's been pushed out because of his folkiness, because people view folk as like a white music. The people who are doing the researching and the blues collecting now have this view of folk music as white music and see Josh White as someone who was trying to like garner a white audience.
Yeah, it's weird how most blues fans these days either want that like really obnoxious electric blues or the like really tragic, sad blues kind of thing. There doesn't seem to be any room for anything in between.
And he seems to have a lot of social commentary in his music.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Yeah, he was doing protest music at the same time as like Woody Guthrie and some of these other folks doing it, but he was black and in much more danger to be singing the kinds of songs he was singing.
Well, I think I read this right when I was doing the research, but one of his protest songs, Frank Sinatra covered and then was in a movie based on the song and won a Grammy for it.
Yeah.
So it's like the same thing of like white people are celebrated when they talk about human rights, but black people are seen as like subversive and controversial.
Yeah, didn't he work with Leadbelly? We talked about Leadbelly.
Oh, we'll get there. We'll get there. Let me jump back into the timeline and get us there, though, real quick. There's a few important things to jump on here. In 1936, he cut his hand up real bad in a bar fight. He got gangrene in the hand, and the doctors all wanted to amputate it, and he kept refusing, said, no, I'm not going to amputate it. And that hand became like virtually useless and immobile for years after that. He was exercising it and doing all kinds of stuff, trying to get it working again, but he could not play guitar and was not performing. Basically ended his music career at that point and was being like a dock worker and working kind of more menial jobs. But then suddenly in 1938, when he was playing poker, his hand just started working again.
Oh man, I would have loved to have been around the poker table that night. That was probably a miraculous night.
Yeah.
Yeah, that must have been an insane celebration.
Royal flush. Also, I can play guitar again. I'm out.
And this coincidentally happened 1938, and there's some producers in Broadway working on a play, John Henry, and they keep trying out people and it's not working. So they start listening to a bunch of race records and trying to narrow it down. And they narrowed it down to this guy they were listening to, Pinewood Tom, and this other one, Josh White, the singing Christian.
It's the same person.
And it's the same person.
Yeah, we've either got to have Josh White or Josh White.
So they brought him onto the play. The play was a fairly big success, but most importantly, it put Josh White in contact with Leadbelly, Woody Guthrie, Burl Ives, and very importantly, Alan Lomax.
Mm-hmm. The younger Lomax.
The younger Lomax.
Son of John Lomax.
I don't know who John Lomax is, should I?
I mean, he was Alan Lomax's father, and together they went around documenting folk artists. And I don't know when John died. I mean, Alan's name is better known of the two, but it was a father-son
I've
effort.
only ever known Alan.
Yeah, I didn't really know John's name until I did an intensive research paper on Leadbelly in college.
So Josh's White's star is rising. He starts performing in the first interracial duo with singer Libby Holman.
Mm-hmm.
And they start performing in venues that were previously segregated. So he's right at the leading edge of trying to end segregation very actively in the places he's performing and with who he's performing with.
She was a pretty radical figure herself. I don't know if you looked into her at all, but...
I only read the tiniest amount. What do you got, Peter?
Oh, I don't know. I know that there was a lot that surrounded her life. I didn't have anything prepared necessarily, but I know that I think she was openly bisexual at the time. And at some points also was accused of murdering her husband, or was suspected of having murdered her husband.
Yeah, that was the only thing I saw.
From what I understand, openly queer musicians in the early folk and blues and gospel culture was much more common than the history books will tell you nowadays.
Really?
Yeah, I know that Sister Rosetta Tharpe was openly bisexual and a few other people who I'm forgetting the names of, but that's definitely something that was intentionally whitewashed and buried over the years.
Interesting.
Where was I? I'm sorry.
Sorry, we
I lost
derailed
my
you
notes
there.
here.
Libby Holman is she is a great singer though. I really like the few recordings that they did together that I was able to find.
Yeah, I listened to a couple of the songs. I didn't something about that like crazy vibrato she uses that was popular in that era was another one of those kind of vocal techniques that annoys me a lot.
Yeah, it reminded me a little of Odetta,
Yeah.
a white Odetta.
Ooh, we could probably cover an Odetta record on this show at some point. That'd be cool.
That would be
Oh,
dope.
I was planning on it. I didn't think her records are very cheap though, are they?
I found them cheap occasionally. I'm sure we could figure out an angle on one of her records. Anyway,
All right.
We'll work on that.
Anyway, Eleanor Roosevelt, heard of her?
Yeah, sounds familiar.
is she related to John Hammond?
She's not related to John Hammond, by blood at least.
Teddy Roosevelt?
No. First Lady, FDR's wife.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that one. Okay.
Yeah, she was mad into folk music and really liked Josh White and invited him to play FDR's inauguration in 1940. During this time, they also initiated a draft where Josh White's brother was drafted into the army, and Josh White saw firsthand how badly the segregated black soldiers were treated compared to the white soldiers. I mean, they had like barracks for the white soldiers, and they would make the black soldiers sleep in tents, like at the training grounds, amongst numerous other mistreatments. So he was trying to push for desegregation in the military. They also wouldn't allow black workers into factories that had war contracts. So the good paying factory jobs were not being offered to people if they were black.
Not surprising.
Eventually, they did, I would say, at least partially credited to Josh White, who was pushing for these things. They did end the segregation of war contracts, though the War Department fought FDR on the desegregation of the military, saying that the military is no place for social experimentation.
Ugh.
But FDR later on heard Josh White's album Southern Exposure, and he was so blown away by it, which FDR was not into folk music. I learned that he was a sea shanty man himself.
Oh, yeah. Naturally, that's what I would have pictured.
Dude loves sea shanties, but he heard Josh White's album and invited him to the White House for doing a private performance. And then he talked to Josh White for several hours afterwards, and they became friends. And the Roosevelts would have the White family over for like Christmas and Thanksgiving and stuff.
Wow. This is during the World War II.
Yeah, this would have been like Josh White's initial heyday, I would say. He was making records with Almanac Singers, as you said, putting out his own stuff that was doing very well.
Yeah, and I guess he really would have he was probably only like, I don't know, 25 or so by this point in time since he had started so young.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. In 1947, I saw he starred in Dreams That Money Can Buy, which was an early film by Hans Richter, Max Ernst, Marcel Duchamp, and a bunch of other Dada artists.
Yeah, Duchamp. Yeah.
So if you're looking for a research rabbit hole listener to get into, read up on the Dadaists. That's a fascinating art movement to learn about.
Yeah, I did a little studying of Berlin Dada in college because it started in Switzerland, I think. The Dada movement.
Yeah, it was primarily a European art movement which makes this even more interesting to me because I don't think of, folk blues music. I see that almost in contrast to Dadaism.
Yeah, although something I meant to point out about that rendition of House of the Rising Sun was there was a little bit of dissonance in White's playing on that was an added ingredient that I really appreciated.
Yeah, and I suppose there's parallel social messages to those things. I just imagine folk and blues being very rooted in realism and plainly telling the reality of what's going on instead of artistically celebrating the absurdity of it.
Yeah, well, I think with Dada, you're almost trying to make people like annoy people or make them uncomfortable to the point that they like question their surroundings and their environment.
Which there's definitely plenty of folk records that are leaning heavier into that concept, but it's you don't find it in any kind of traditional folk stylings usually.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to play another jam before we
Perfect time for that.
cruise further into this.
What do you got next?
I want to play. This one is actually sung by his son, Josh White Jr., but he's playing a Woody Guthrie classic, Pastures of Plenty.
It's a mighty hard road my poor hands have hoed, my poor feet have traveled that hot, dusty road from out of your dust bowl, and westward we rode. Your desert was hot, and your mountains were so cold. California, Arizona, I've worked on your crops. Then it's north up to Oregon to harvest your hops. Dig the beets from your ground, the grapes off your vines, to set on your table that sparkling wine.
Wow, that straight ahead strumming, kind of raw. That's really different than a lot of the other tracks I've listened to of his so far, as far as guitar style. That wasn't something I was expecting. It's really like raw folk right there.
Yeah, I wonder if Josh White Jr. is a guitar player himself. It's not clear on the record as to whether maybe that might be Josh White Jr. actually playing guitar there.
Okay, yeah,
'Cause that is
it's
not his style.
yeah, that really jumped out at me. So that might explain things. I guess we're not certain. I mean, I liked it. I enjoyed it, but it was definitely, if this was recorded in 1961, it sounded a lot more what folk artists doing later in the decade were doing.
Yeah.
So Josh White Jr. would have been 21 at the time of recording that. So it says that he officially made his professional debut at the age of 4 singing with his dad. So it very well could have been him playing guitar at that point, because he's now 79 years old and still relatively active performing and recording music.
Oh, nice.
And I also saw that in the early 80s, he starred in a stage biography of his father's life, which is pretty interesting. I wonder if there's any recorded evidence of that anywhere.
I liked the bass in there too. Boom, 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 boom.
Yeah, it was nice. Nice bass. Well, I'll round the corner on this biography because sadly we're almost to the end of it. Because his star rose, he was big. He was one of the early black artists that was appealing to large amounts of white audiences as well. But come 1950, we get Truman, and we get the McCarthyites, and Josh White is put on the blacklist. He is labeled a commie and told in Hollywood and TV studios that they're not supposed to show him on TV. His album sales plummet.
HUAC went after him.
Yeah.
The Red Scare.
Yep. Not only that, they also. So he, at this point, moves to London and continues to perform in Europe where he can still perform and not be taken out of the spotlight, essentially. When he comes back to America, they detain him and questioned him for the FBI detained and questioned him for 6 hours. Some people believe they may have threatened him with information they had on him, but essentially they wanted him to go in front of HUAC, the Un-American Committee or whatever, and denounce something that they claim Paul Robeson, who was also in the John Henry play that Josh White was in. They claim that Paul Robeson had said the American Negro would never fight the Soviet Union, and this would have been right when the Korean War was starting. So they wanted Josh White to go in front of HUAC and say that that's a horrible statement and that he believes he would fight for America and that Paul Robeson's a commie and all that. And Josh White does not really say that to the committee, though there's like one line where he says like he would go fight for America. And the media naturally just latched onto that one line, ignored all the rest of his statement and all the liberal sentiments within it. And he was painted as basically someone who narked on Robeson. And as a result, though, he was not even removed from the blacklist. So he was essentially pushed away by the left for making these statements and then was also still blacklisted.
Yeah, for our listeners, if you're not familiar with HUAC, it was the House Un-American Activities Committee that was created. I think it was, I want to say like 1938 or 1939 during the Red Scare. It was created to investigate like alleged disloyalty or subversive activities on the part of private citizens, public employees, and like organizations that were suspected of having fascist or communist ties. And there were a lot of people in like Hollywood that got put on it, blacklisted as a result of HUAC.
Yeah. And like Alan Lomax, Woody Guthrie, all those dudes were on it too.
Yeah. Anyone suspected of thinking outside of the box and pushing that agenda out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it led to a lot of great artists being basically ruined and oftentimes driven to an untimely death as a result of their career and reputation being destroyed overnight.
Yeah.
And also, it needs to be said that the whole angle of Josh White narking on Paul Robeson was not true because Josh went and like had a private meeting with Paul Robeson the night before making the statement and read Paul his entire planned statement. They had the meeting in their bathroom with all the water running because Paul knew that his house was tapped by the FBI and it was the only way they could actually have a private conversation about this topic.
Wow.
Basically, Josh White said as much as he thought he was being required to say. And I mean, he wasn't narking at all at any point. They just took like the one thing they wanted out of context, plastered it all over the newspapers, and ruined his career essentially.
Right, because the Paul Robeson quote was taken out of context anyway and has since been proven to be not even what he was trying to say in that statement. And that's part of what Josh White was saying. Like, if that is what Paul Robeson said, I stand against that, and here's why. But then, of course, they just took it as like, well, he confirmed that Paul Robeson is a commie that is like anti-American and condemned him, but he's also still a communist, so just fuck all of them.
Yeah, they used him and threw him out. I don't know if it's attributable to that or, growing up shoeless and nutritionally deficient as a child, but he spent a lot of the 50s dealing with health conditions. He had bad ulcers, he had severe psoriasis, chronic calcium deficiency, and emphysema that he was struggling with. And this all led to his first heart attack in 1961.
Well, the same year as this record.
Yeah,
The
and all of
same
those
year as
things
this
would
record.
definitely be conditions aggravated by stress, which is what he was dealing with at that point. So,
Yeah, so that was the year he recorded this record, and kind of the early 60s, there was a folk revival of sorts happening that he sort of rode that wave back into the public consciousness through the early and mid 60s, kind of starting with this record, really. But you can tell by how many of the tracks on here that his son and his daughter are on that he's not 100% health wise. He's not running these shows himself anymore.
This was on Mercury Records, correct?
True.
Okay, so pretty major label. He's still working with the majors at this point.
Yeah, this came out on Mercury Records. Previous to this, he started putting out records with Elektra, who Jack Holtzman, who started Elektra Records, signed him early on and essentially broke the McCarthyite blacklisting by giving him a deal. Josh White was a big success for Elektra Records and launched them into being able to sign more folk artists and later on a lot of the early rock artists like the Stooges, MC5, The Doors, Love, Tim Buckley, Bread. None of that would have happened if it weren't for Josh White's John Henry album selling as many copies with Elektra as it did.
Wow, unsung hero there in many regards, but
Yeah.
that's major too.
Yeah, and it created a place for a lot of other folk artists, you were saying, right, Sean?
yeah, it's like a lot of early hit records were by artists like Theodore Bickel, Judy Collins, Phil Oakes, Tom Paxton.
Yeah. So Josh White, essentially, they used his name and fame that he had garnered previous to the blacklisting and were able to tap into that to launch their label, essentially.
That's major.
Yeah. And in 63, JFK broke the TV blacklisting finally by having Josh White perform on a CBS civil rights special that was like a concert that civil rights activists and musicians were playing at. And then in 1965, guess where he plays?
Would that be the Newport Folk Festival?
Yeah, we mentioned it last week. Also there with the Chambers Brothers was Josh White. Not playing with the Chambers Brothers, obviously.
That would have been a legendary collab, though.
True, that would have been far. Actually, it probably would have been amazing if they did some gospel stuff.
Oh my god, yeah, it would have been crazy.
I wonder if there's documentation of Josh White's performance from that.
I think a lot of the performances that weekend were recorded because there's a Newport 65 album that came out, but I don't know if the stuff that didn't make the album cut has been preserved in any way.
Hopefully. Have to look into it. Interesting you said that JFK was involved with in front of the cameras is doing something progressive. It's weird how behind the scenes he was so different, as we discussed in previous episodes.
Yeah, it was Sammy Davis.
I mean, that was just so wrong on so many levels. And I hear more and more stuff about JFK along those lines.
Yeah, he was more a product of his time than a visionary away from it, in my humble opinion.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen him express admiration for things Hitler did, but that's a different podcast.
Woo. Full JFK takedown on this podcast, eh, boys?
I'm ready for it.
He's going to come back for us. He's going to team up with Jimmy Page and Phil Spector.
Oh, no. And who was the guy last week?
Yeah, who did we take down last week?
Oh, the owner of Columbia Records.
Clive Davis.
Clive Davis.
Yeah.
Oh, he's got it in for I'd buy that for $1 for sure.
Yeah, we're taking down notable white men one episode at a time here. Setting the record
They're gonna
straight.
Scooby-Doo us, guys. Well, that brings us pretty much to the end of the story. He played LBJ's inauguration, and then in 1969, he died during heart surgery. He had 3 heart attacks. They were trying to do a valve surgery, and it did not work. So he passed away at the age of 54.
He really seems to have packed a lot in, though. It seems like there's a lot of material to dive into with this guy, and why haven't I really heard of him before? I mean,
Yeah. He went from literally being shoeless on the streets to playing 2 presidential inaugurations. So,
now I'm guessing, Jeremy, since you didn't want to focus heavily on Sammy Davis's filmography and his acting ventures, I'm guessing that you didn't go into great depth with Josh White's thespian turns, but it seems that he did act in a number of things, stage and in film, correct?
Yeah, and even his Wikipedia page states that it's commonly accepted that he would have been a much bigger film star if it wasn't for the McCarthyism. He was a rising star and seemed poised to take Hollywood by storm at that point.
yeah, he was seen as like a sex symbol.
Yeah.
He popularized playing with his top 2 buttons undone and was seen as the ladies thought he was a hottie.
I'm guessing he was probably one of the first, or if not the very first, black male sex symbol.
There was also a lot of tabloid controversy that some very influential, famous white women had affairs with him. Nothing notable seems to have been proven, but it's also rumored that had a lot to do with him being a special target of McCarthyism, not just his humanitarian efforts and protest songs, but the fact that he seemed to be a black person that white women really like to have sex with.
Josh White gets it on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I saw that some people believed the FBI knew about that and was using it to force him into making those statements that he made,
Right.
but I don't know any of that for sure.
Yeah, nothing's been proven, but it definitely doesn't seem out of the question by any means.
Dude's a hottie.
True.
Hell yeah. Well, is that all we have for this episode, or do we got any similar artists we want to
I think it's
recommend?
time we unplug the open sign, lock up the front door,
Count down the register.
count down the register, and close up shop.
Sweep the floor.
Sweep the floor for this week.
Have one last shifty with the boys, and then go home to the wife and kids. Am I right?
You got it, partner. I don't know what just happened.
Recommended artist, Paul Robeson is definitely top of the list. Similar styles, similar career trajectory, and incredible musician whose records are very underpriced usually.
And the inventor of robo-tripping?
Yeah, probably.
Inaccurate.
Okay, we'll draw the line there. That was inaccurate, inappropriate.
Maybe would Cisco Houston count? That feels maybe in that vein.
Yeah, he is one of the legendary folk guys that is often underpriced, it would seem. Another blues duo that I more commonly find is Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. That's
Oh yeah, Sonny
yeah,
some
Terry.
of the only authentic blues and a lot of folk blues stuff as well that is just as good as everything else, but is still cheap for some unknown reason.
I'm sure we'll find out on a later podcast.
I'm sure we could get one of their records on here. That'd be awesome. And those guys also recorded with Woody Guthrie as well.
Nice. Well, Sean, you want to turn the light off?
I think it's about that time, Jeremiah.
Go ahead. Say the words, Sean.
Well, thank you one and all for spending a little time with us here, and I'd buy that for $1. We hope to be with you again next week.
I'm Jeremy Ruggles.
I'm Peter Cook.
And I'm Sean Hartman.
We'll see you upside down next week.
Oh, foreshadowing.
Ooh, I'm going to leave y'all with What You Gonna Do
I'm going to listen to this song.
by Josh White.
What you gonna do when you meet gives out, my baby? What you gonna do when you meet gives out, my honey? What you gonna do when you meet gives out? Stand around the corner, mouth in a pop.
Thanks for listening to another quality episode of I'd Buy That for $1. We would like to just gently remind you that if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. You can find us on Instagram, on Facebook, and this podcast is available at pretty much any streaming service that you might normally find podcasts. Just hit that subscribe button and you'll get those notifications every Tuesday when we drop a new episode. And if you could find in your heart to tell a friend, spread the word a little bit, keep that organic growth going for us so that, we'll keep making these amazing episodes for you. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
Slats in the bed go blam to blam in the morning. Slats in the bed go blam to blam in the evening. Slats in the bed go blam to blam, but I'll go to sleep and I don't give a damn sometimes. What you gonna do when your man gives out, my baby? What you gonna do when your man gives out, my honey? First I'll grab my money and kick him off.